Picture the biggest warship you have ever seen, and now triple its massive scale in your mind. The USS Abraham Lincoln is a magnificent floating city powered by two immense nuclear reactors, carrying 90 advanced combat aircraft and a highly trained crew of over 5,600 personnel. She cost over $4.5 billion to construct, representing the absolute pinnacle of naval engineering and military projection. She never sails without a formidable armada of cruisers, destroyers, and nuclear attack submarines, whose only job is to make sure nothing gets close to her formidable steel hull. The United States Navy considered this defensive shield completely unbreakable, an impenetrable fortress of radar and sonar dominating the ocean. The punchline of this historical episode is devastating. But the setup is even better because this is not a story about a lucky shot or a simulation quirk. In the summer of the year 2000, a humble diesel-electric submarine crewed by a handful of Australians crawled straight through that billion-dollar shield without triggering a single alarm. She parked herself at point-blank range, raised her periscope into the formation, and calmly photographed the mighty carrier through a torpedo crosshair. If this had been a real, unrestricted combat engagement, the Abraham Lincoln and everyone stationed aboard her would have been resting on the dark ocean floor before the escort vessels even knew something was fundamentally wrong. The silent submarine that pulled off this astonishing tactical masterpiece, the HMAS Waller, was ironically a boat that Australian newspapers had spent several years relentlessly calling a complete national embarrassment. Her own home country simply did not believe in her capabilities or her design. Yet, the most powerful and technologically advanced navy in all of human history was about to severely wish they had. This narrative meticulously documents how the absolute most mocked military procurement program in Australian history managed to produce one of the most consequential tactical demonstrations of the modern era. To understand this properly, we must necessarily begin by examining the brutal insult that started it all. Throughout the late 1990s, the Collins-class submarine project was undisputedly the biggest punchline in the Australian defense sector. The program had originally begun with staggering, almost unprecedented ambition roughly a decade earlier when the Royal Australian Navy decided to finally replace its aging Oberon-class boats with something truly revolutionary. Their ultimate vision was to construct the absolute largest and most inherently capable diesel-electric submarine ever designed by marine engineers. It was meticulously designed specifically for traversing the vast, unforgiving patrol distances of the strategically critical Indo-Pacific region. The lucrative contract went to the established Swedish shipbuilder Kockums, officially partnering with the newly formed Australian Submarine Corporation located in Adelaide. The sheer scale was magnificent, promising 6 massive boats, 5 billion Australian dollars injected into the economy, and an entirely sovereign submarine building industry effectively created from absolute scratch on the remote southern continent. On paper and in government briefings, this ambitious project appeared extraordinarily visionary and brilliantly conceived. In harsh reality, however, the execution slowly transformed into a very painful, publicly agonizing catastrophe playing out in agonizingly slow motion. The very first boat of the fleet, proudly named HMAS Collins, officially launched into the water in 1996, and almost immediately, the severe technical failures cascaded uncontrollably. The complex diesel engines broke down with frustrating regularity during critical tests. Rampant fuel contamination persistently corroded vital internal components, fundamentally compromising the mechanical integrity of the newly minted vessel. Water stubbornly leaked into sensitive compartments where corrosive seawater should absolutely never be permitted to enter under any circumstances. Furthermore, the main propeller, heavily redesigned quite late in the manufacturing process without conducting proper acoustic retesting, generated a catastrophic amount of cavitation noise underwater. For a stealth submarine that was explicitly supposed to be ranked among the absolute quietest combat vessels in the entire world, this engineering blunder was practically the acoustic equivalent of strapping a massive, blaring rock concert loudspeaker directly to the outer hull. The vessel was screaming its exact coordinates to everyone. The integrated combat system arguably fared even worse than the flawed mechanical propulsion elements during these disastrous early trials. The original software integration desperately trying to link the Swedish hull systems with the incredibly complex American weapons package collapsed so completely and thoroughly that the entire digital framework eventually had to be unceremoniously scrapped. It was completely replaced from scratch at immense additional cost. Optical periscopes shook violently under hydrodynamic pressure until the targeted image blurred entirely. Furthermore, the primary communications gear was fundamentally outdated long before the expensive boats ever officially entered active operational service. Dangerous welding defects dangerously riddled the critical bow sections initially built by the overseas Swedish subcontractors, deeply alarming naval inspectors. Interestingly, the Australian-built hull sections were largely clean and structurally sound. But this was a subtle nuance that absolutely nobody in the hostile press cared about analyzing. The media feeding frenzy surrounding the project was absolutely merciless and unending. Australian newspapers aggressively stamped the expensive submarines with a deeply humiliating label that stubbornly stuck for many years in the public consciousness. They relentlessly printed glaring headlines calling them the dud subs, cementing their awful reputation. Opinion columnists fiercely competed among themselves to coin the absolute most vicious and entertaining description of the troubled boats. One particularly famous journalist harshly compared the vessel's underwater noise signature to a chaotic heavy metal rock concert. Opportunistic politicians gleefully weaponized the floundering program during bitter election campaigns to score easy points. A completely devastating 1999 government review, widely known as the Macintosh-Prescott Report, officially declared the submarines fundamentally unfit for modern military operations. The damning document clearly stated that the entire multi-billion-dollar strategic project was currently locked in an unrecoverable crisis. The comprehensive report grimly noted that Australia's immediate strategic circumstances would have to be extremely serious to actively risk deploying these vulnerable submarines in their current degraded state. One official openly complained, stating clearly that these platforms are practically useless for any real combat deployment right now. That single devastating sentence alone was more than enough to completely bury public confidence for many consecutive years. People felt intensely betrayed by the staggering financial waste. Now, here is the exact moment where the entire historical story miraculously pivots and transforms into something truly legendary. Because the vast majority of people only heard the deafening noise of the endless political scandals, they completely stopped listening to the quiet progress happening in the background. What the ignorant politicians and cynical journalists entirely missed was the returning quiet. Brilliant naval engineers had been diligently working through the enormous mountain of structural problems methodically and silently. They refused to completely abandon the core vision of this platform. The terrible propellers were carefully redesigned and rigorously tested. The problematic hull flow issues were quietly corrected to completely eliminate the treacherous drag and noise. The unreliable diesel engines were entirely rebuilt from the ground up to guarantee absolute operational reliability during long patrols. The hopeless combat system was swiftly replaced with a highly functional and lethal American digital alternative. Piece by piece, bolt by heavy bolt, the Collins class was being miraculously transformed from a pathetic procurement disaster into something absolutely nobody expected. It quietly became a genuinely lethal weapons platform. The third completed boat in the specific class, officially named HMAS Waller, eventually commissioned in July 1999, entered active service with significantly fewer defects than her older sisters. But by the time this advanced submarine truly became functional, the terrible national reputation was already set in hard concrete. The cynical Australian public only saw an incredibly expensive joke floating in the harbor. Elite American submariners, who regularly operated massive nuclear boats with unlimited range and terrifying reactor-powered speed, looked at the Collins class and merely saw a quaint diesel relic from a previous century. When HMAS Waller finally sailed to Hawaii for the massive international war game, absolutely nobody expected her to do anything remarkable. That arrogant expectation was their very first mistake. Understanding the second massive mistake requires fully understanding what the heavily mocked HMAS Waller was actually up against during this massive exercise. The USS Abraham Lincoln, bearing the official hull number CVN-72, is a terrifying Nimitz-class nuclear-powered aircraft carrier originally commissioned in 1989. She stretches majestically over 332 meters from her sharp bow to her massive stern. Two incredible Westinghouse nuclear reactors generate 260,000 shaft horsepower, pushing this 100,000-ton steel behemoth past 30 knots. Her immense flight deck spans considerably more than 4.5 acres, aggressively operating up to 90 advanced combat aircraft simultaneously. This formidable aerial arsenal includes deadly Super Hornets, sophisticated Hawkeye early warning planes, and versatile Seahawk helicopters patrolling the skies. Her dedicated crew consistently tops 5,600 personnel, representing a floating population significantly larger than most rural Australian country towns. She initially cost over $4.5 billion to completely build, and her midlife reactor refueling alone ran to another $2 billion. However, military strategists know that the magnificent carrier itself is not actually the primary weapon in this vast oceanic theater. The heavily integrated carrier strike group is the true weapon, operating as an interconnected digital and physical fortress. In the eventful year 2000, the complex formation directly protecting the Abraham Lincoln was arguably the most formidable anti-submarine barrier ever successfully put to sea. Start analyzing with the massive outer defensive ring, comprised of incredibly lethal Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruisers, equipped with the legendary Aegis Combat System network. This advanced radar and weapons network was so incredibly sophisticated that it could effortlessly track well over 100 airborne targets simultaneously. While doing so, it flawlessly coordinated intensive anti-submarine operations across hundreds of square miles of turbulent ocean surface. These imposing cruisers alone cost well over $1 billion each, and they consistently carried their own deadly complement of specialized anti-submarine torpedoes. If you successfully moved inward past this first terrifying barrier, you would immediately hit the fiercely capable Arleigh Burke-class destroyers hunting relentlessly for contacts. Each one of these powerful destroyers came completely equipped with massive hull-mounted sonar arrays scanning the deep waters. They deployed heavy-towed sonar arrays that streamed thousands of feet behind the speeding ship, effectively acting as incredibly sensitive underwater tripwires. Furthermore, they commanded rapid-response anti-submarine torpedo launchers perfectly ready to drop lethal high-explosive ordnance on absolutely any unverified acoustic contact within mere seconds. To complement this, deadly P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft constantly flew strict racetrack patterns directly above the waves, completely dominating the aerial tactical environment. These specialized planes systematically dropped numerous sonobuoys into the dark water by the absolute dozen. They created hundreds of floating microphones, effectively knitting together a remarkably vast acoustic dragnet stretching entirely across the designated operational area. The entire integrated defensive package cost upward of $20 billion to maintain and successfully embodied a strict tactical doctrine the United States Navy treated as absolute religious gospel. They firmly and arrogantly believed that absolutely nothing could possibly get through this highly advanced, incredibly expensive, mathematically perfect protective screen undetected. Below the churning surface, extremely dangerous Los Angeles-class nuclear attack submarines silently patrolled their strictly assigned geographic sectors. Each one of these imposing vessels was a heavily armed 110-meter underwater predator. They carried enormous payloads of highly destructive Mark 48 torpedoes. They featured advanced passive sonar arrays so incredibly sensitive they could distinctly hear an unknown mechanical contact closing from many miles away. These formidable nuclear boats were specifically designed and fiercely trained for exactly one singular, absolutely ruthless military purpose. Their sole mission was to aggressively find, flawlessly track, and completely eliminate highly dangerous enemy submarines long before those hostile vessels got anywhere near the incredibly valuable aircraft carrier. The proud Americans believed in this complex system absolutely, and they believed it for a historically validated reason that ironically also became their fatal strategic blind spot. For multiple decades, United States anti-submarine warfare had been meticulously optimized and continuously funded for fighting exactly one specific type of highly dangerous global opponent during the long Cold War. They were incredibly prepared to fight nuclear submarines, massive Soviet boomers, deeply hidden Russian attack boats, and highly advanced Chinese nuclear-powered vessels rapidly expanding their aggressive presence into the contested Pacific. These were the specific, terrifying threats that fundamentally shaped complex American sonar calibration routines, intensive training protocols, and foundational tactical doctrine. All advanced nuclear submarines inherently share one inescapable, heavily fatal physical vulnerability that no amount of engineering can completely mask or perfectly eliminate. They absolutely rely upon a massive nuclear reactor that never entirely shuts off. Their massive internal coolant pumps must continuously run at all times to prevent catastrophic meltdowns, thereby endlessly producing a very distinctive, low-frequency hum that highly trained acoustic operators can consistently detect. Elite American submariners hunted the specific acoustic fingerprint of these massive nuclear reactors. They knew this distinct mechanical signature intimately. Their entire rigid naval philosophy heavily assumed that the approaching underwater threat always made some detectable baseline noise. HMAS Waller, quite shockingly, did not make any mechanical noise whatsoever. That flawed assumption was the second catastrophic mistake. A traditional diesel-electric submarine certainly runs incredibly loud when operating on the open surface. The massive roaring diesels actively charge the heavy battery banks, creating tremendous acoustic disruption. However, once she completely dives beneath the waves and quietly switches to securely stored electrical power, the fundamental physics of her propulsion change completely. Suddenly, there are absolutely no loud spinning turbines, no vibrating internal coolant pumps, and absolutely no continuous low-frequency reactor hum echoing through the dark water. The heavy electric motor steadily turns the large main propeller. It performs this crucial mechanical action with almost no detectable acoustic signature whatsoever. The dark submerged boat literally becomes significantly quieter than the natural ambient background noise of the vast ocean itself. Furthermore, the heavily criticized Collins class actually possessed one incredibly potent additional technological trick up its sleeve. This specific modification significantly amplified their inherent stealth advantage to an almost absurd, completely unfair degree against acoustic sensors. The entire outer pressure hull was meticulously wrapped in thousands of highly specialized, incredibly expensive anechoic rubberized stealth tiles. These soft rubberized panels brilliantly absorbed powerful incoming active sonar pings instead of aggressively bouncing them back toward the searching destroyers. A highly sensitive passive sonar array absolutely could not hear the creeping Waller because she was currently generating virtually zero detectable mechanical sound. Furthermore, an extremely powerful active sonar system incredibly could not see her because its own focused acoustic signals simply vanished entirely into those specialized rubber tiles. It was exactly like a desperate, incredibly loud human shout being instantly and completely absorbed by thick fog. She became perfectly translated into the complex operational language of modern acoustic naval warfare, an invisible, absolutely terrifying physical black hole. The massive RIMPAC 2000 exercise officially kicked off on the 30th of May and aggressively ran through the 6th of July. It impressively featured well over 50 heavily armed warships, 200 advanced aircraft, and 22,000 highly trained personnel operating together. 7 allied nations deployed their finest maritime assets into the deep tactical waters directly off the scenic coast of beautiful Hawaii under strict central command. HMAS Waller initially started the massive simulated exercise operating securely within a highly cooperative, fully friendly defensive role alongside her massive American counterparts. She proudly became the very first Australian submarine ever allowed to actively operate as a fully integrated tactical component of a United States carrier battle group. Her assigned job was aggressively hunting simulated enemy submarines, actively threatening the USS Abraham Lincoln. She performed this defensive task so incredibly effectively that extremely experienced American naval officers were openly, genuinely surprised by her lethal operational efficiency. But that highly successful initial performance was absolutely just the polite preliminary warm-up act for the astonished international audience. The truly terrifying main show suddenly began when the rigid exercise controllers deliberately switched her operational role entirely. Suddenly, the underestimated Waller was absolutely no longer a loyal, well-behaved defensive guard dog patrolling the perimeter. She was instantly designated as the aggressively hostile wolf. Her brand new assigned mission was to completely penetrate the mighty carrier strike group's inner defenses and immediately simulate a devastating, unprovoked attack. This specific simulated scenario was exactly where undisputed American naval dominance was historically supposed to be completely and utterly absolute. This highly anticipated tactical demonstration was fundamentally designed to loudly justify over $20 billion of advanced defensive maritime hardware. This was the incredibly rigid operational script that absolutely every single American naval exercise had reliably followed for many consecutive years without fail. The hostile adversary gets rapidly found, aggressively tracked, and completely neutralized long before ever successfully reaching their designated lethal weapons range against the protected carrier. The brilliantly unorthodox Australian captain deliberately tore up that predictable, highly scripted tactical narrative and audaciously wrote a completely new one. He skillfully took the silent submarine deep below the ocean's natural thermocline, a distinct physical temperature boundary existing in the dark water, where warmer surface currents violently meet significantly colder deep oceanic water. This invisible underwater boundary is absolutely not just a simple, unnoticeable oceanic temperature shift. It actively functions as a massive, completely impenetrable acoustic wall that effectively shields anything hiding silently beneath its swirling depths. Powerful incoming active sonar signals violently hitting this chaotic oceanic thermocline physically bend, randomly scatter, and immediately lose their structural acoustic coherence. These highly focused energy waves start severely refracting away from any hidden metallic target sitting quietly beneath the thermal gradient, behaving exactly like focused light abruptly bending through thick, highly uneven glass. Consequently, the incredibly sophisticated American surface sensors aggressively pinging downward only received heavily distorted, hopelessly fragmented acoustic returns that essentially provided absolutely zero actionable tactical data for the highly trained fleet operators. Their incredibly sophisticated, massively expensive digital sonar suites were specifically designed and historically calibrated to effortlessly burn directly through this specific thermal interference when hunting massive nuclear submarines. This was entirely because those massive nuclear boats still continuously emitted a loud, highly distinctive reactor hum that dependably gave the advanced sonar processing computers something solid to violently lock onto, even straight through the severe thermocline distortion. But the remarkably stealthy Australian vessel was currently not emitting absolutely anything remotely detectable by these highly specialized, billion-dollar digital acoustic sensors. She was fundamentally just a totally silent, completely dead object brilliantly hiding directly behind a massive natural curtain of complex oceanic physics that advanced American technology absolutely could not cleanly penetrate without an active acoustic signature to target. Then, the focused Australian captain ruthlessly cut the loud diesel engines, immediately switched entirely to stored electrical batteries, and aggressively shut down absolutely every single non-essential mechanical system aboard the entire boat. The humming air conditioning system instantly went completely offline, plunging the heavy steel hull into a stifling, oppressive humidity. The internal electrical lighting drastically dropped down to the absolute bare emergency minimums, casting long, deeply unsettling shadows across the cramped operational compartments. The busy galley equipment completely shut down, leaving the anxious crew eating cold rations in the suffocating gloom. The boat literally became a dark, incredibly hot steel coffin, continuously drifting forward in absolute, terrifying mechanical silence. It was entirely powered by nothing but slowly draining stored electricity and bravely crewed by focused men breathing stale, recycled air while operating in near total, suffocating darkness. Far above their submerged heads, the massive, incredibly expensive American anti-submarine search machine aggressively cranked into absolute full operational gear. Powerful guided missile destroyers ruthlessly swept the turbulent ocean surface with their enormous, hull-mounted active sonars and thousands of feet of deeply towed passive acoustic arrays. Sleek maritime patrol aircraft aggressively dropped massive, highly coordinated sonobuoy patterns across miles of water, desperately listening for absolutely any faint whisper of moving mechanical machinery hiding somewhere far below the choppy surface of the increasingly tense Pacific operational theater. Massive Los Angeles-class nuclear attack submarines aggressively prowled through their strictly assigned underwater defensive sectors like heavily armed metallic sharks. Their incredibly sensitive passive acoustic arrays were painfully straining for the absolute faintest, most distant trace of hostile mechanical propulsion. These elite operators distinctly heard the natural roaring ocean. They loudly heard the clicking marine life. They clearly heard the massive propellers of their own speeding surface ships. However, they absolutely did not hear the creeping, utterly silent form of the stealthy HMAS Waller. The drastically underestimated Australian submarine deliberately did not aggressively chase the speeding American aircraft carrier through the contested dark water. She absolutely did not foolishly attempt to rapidly outrun the heavily armed escorts or audaciously dash straight through the tightly overlapping digital gaps in the massive defensive sensor screen. Any sudden burst of mechanical speed would have instantly meant creating lethal acoustic noise, and generating that specific noise would have immediately guaranteed rapid detection and simulated destruction. Instead, the brilliant Australian captain employed a terrifyingly ancient hunting tactic. He flawlessly executed an absolutely flawless, utterly cold-blooded ambush, heavily relying upon extreme tactical patience. He carefully calculated the massive USS Abraham Lincoln's strictly projected navigational course directly from the highly classified, pre-briefed exercise parameters. He then brilliantly factored in the massive aircraft carrier's historically known, highly predictable physical turning patterns and rigid operational transit habits. Armed with this crucial intelligence, he boldly positioned the silent HMAS Waller directly along the absolute most probable oceanic path of the approaching American Leviathan, and then he simply waited in the suffocating dark. They endured grueling, intensely agonizing hours of endlessly waiting inside an incredibly dark, brutally sweltering metallic submarine currently running entirely on limited battery power with absolutely no active air conditioning whatsoever. Heavy, uncomfortable condensation steadily dripped loudly from the curved steel overhead pipes, splashing onto the metal deck. The highly disciplined, heavily sweating crew was sitting frozen at their crucial battle stations in near total, absolute silence because they strictly knew that even heavy human footsteps, clumsily echoing through a steel hull, could fatally betray their hidden tactical position. The HMAS Waller successfully transformed into a deadly, invisible metallic crocodile, resting quietly in incredibly dark, heavily contested water. She remained completely motionless, practically invisible to billion-dollar sensors, and displayed a terrifying level of extreme tactical patience sitting far beyond what most rational humans would ever consider logically reasonable during a modern naval exercise. She occasionally crept forward at an incredibly slow walking speed, sometimes utilizing barely enough electrical thrust to merely maintain proper depth control against the powerful, deeply shifting oceanic currents constantly pushing against her black rubberized hull. At those creeping, incredibly deliberate velocities, the ambient biological noise of the vast Pacific Ocean was actually significantly louder than absolutely anything her highly efficient electric motor produced. Snapping shrimp continuously clicking in the deep oceanic trenches completely masked her acoustic presence. The natural, resonant groan of the shifting ocean floor was noticeably louder than the silent Australian hunter. The heavily mocked HMAS Waller brilliantly became the absolute quietest physical object currently operating within her own incredibly dangerous, highly contested tactical environment during the massive RIMPAC exercise. The incredibly expensive, technologically dominant American defensive screen completely passed directly around her or sailed completely over her submerged position without noticing a single thing. The mighty Ticonderoga-class Aegis cruisers, imposing ships whose highly classified combat systems alone cost substantially more than the entire controversial Collins submarine program, registered absolutely nothing on their sophisticated displays. The massive, deeply towed acoustic arrays connected to the speeding Arleigh Burke-class destroyers simply dragged through empty water, picking up absolutely no mechanical anomalies or hostile propulsion signatures whatsoever. The deadly Los Angeles-class nuclear attack submarines, each one proudly crewed by 130 of the absolute best-trained, most experienced submariners in the entire world, caught absolutely nothing on their highly sensitive passive listening systems. The massive sonobuoy network floating above heard nothing but empty water exactly where HMAS Waller was quietly sitting with a completely full tactical load of heavyweight Mark 48 torpedoes. The highly disciplined Australian crew had literally not made a single detectable sound in several agonizing, deeply tense hours. Then, demonstrating absolutely breathtaking tactical audacity, the silent HMAS Waller smoothly broke the turbulent ocean surface with her optical periscope squarely inside the highly restricted inner defensive ring of the massive carrier strike group. She was currently sitting at the absolute ideal, undeniably lethal torpedo firing range. The towering USS Abraham Lincoln completely filled the narrow periscope optic. She was absolutely not just a tiny, distant gray silhouette safely positioned on the far horizon, but a massive, towering wall of imposing gray steel dominating the immediate view. The massive target was currently so incredibly close to the hidden Australian submarine that a catastrophic physical miss was essentially a complete mathematical and physical impossibility. Each deadly Mark 48 heavyweight torpedo currently loaded in the Waller's forward launch tubes carried a massive 295-kilogram high-explosive warhead. These devastating underwater weapons could rapidly close on their designated steel target at speeds well over 55 knots, leaving the giant carrier absolutely no viable time to execute any successful evasive maneuvers or deploy defensive countermeasures. The highly focused Australian submarine crew calmly and methodically photographed the massive aircraft carrier's vulnerable lower hull directly through the intersecting lines of their torpedo crosshair. They efficiently locked a flawless firing solution into their recently upgraded tactical combat system and instantly transmitted the simulated, highly lethal torpedo launch sequence to the central exercise controllers. In the incredibly cold, completely unforgiving analytical language of modern naval war games, the mighty USS Abraham Lincoln was officially gone, instantly erased from the massive operational board by a supposedly obsolete vessel. Over $4.5 billion of absolute peak American naval engineering had just been completely eliminated by a humble submarine currently running entirely on rechargeable electrical batteries. Furthermore, the relentlessly mocked Australian vessel had already secretly taken 2 highly prized scalps long before ever reaching the massive carrier. On her incredibly stealthy way into the heavily defended inner circle, she had successfully engaged and cleanly scored verified simulated hits on 2 separate Los Angeles-class nuclear attack submarines prowling the dark waters of the designated operational area. These were the very elite nuclear boats specifically designed and massively funded by the Pentagon to aggressively prevent exactly this catastrophic scenario from ever successfully happening. 2 pristine, $600 million nuclear underwater predators were embarrassingly caught and completely neutralized by the very boat Australian newspapers had viciously called a leaky, rusty bucket. The immediate reaction at the absolute highest command level of the United States Navy was definitely not polite, standard professional acknowledgement. It was instead a state of absolute profound and utterly undeniable strategic shock. The powerful, deeply ingrained myth of the completely invulnerable American carrier strike group had absolutely not been violently dented by a massive superpower rival possessing practically bottomless military resources. It had instead been completely punctured and deeply humiliated by a small handful of focused Australians operating aboard the absolute most publicly ridiculed and heavily criticized diesel submarine in the entire Western world. This deeply unsettling revelation immediately triggered massive shockwaves throughout the upper echelons of the gathered international military leadership actively observing the ongoing Pacific War game. The terrifying strategic implications heavily settled over the exercise controllers as they frantically reviewed the undeniable digital data. If the heavily flawed Waller could easily accomplish this devastating feat during a scheduled peacetime exercise where absolutely everyone actively knew she was out there hunting, the future looked grim. What exactly could a modern, highly advanced Chinese diesel boat silently achieve deep inside the highly contested Taiwan Strait during a massive, real-world naval conflict? The terrifying answers to these urgent questions profoundly disturbed the American operational commanders analyzing the results. What devastating damage could stealthy Iranian Kilo-class submarines inflict operating quietly within the extremely shallow, highly acoustically cluttered waters of the strategic Persian Gulf? What could a dozen highly motivated North Korean coastal defense boats do to a massive carrier group operating dangerously near the volatile Korean peninsula? The underestimated HMAS Waller had absolutely not just scored a brilliant simulated hit on the prized Abraham Lincoln. She had effectively blown a massive, completely undeniable hole squarely through foundational American strategic naval assumptions held for several decades. That gaping theoretical hole was literally wide enough to smoothly sail an entire Nimitz-class aircraft carrier right through without accidentally scraping the painted sides. Consider the utterly brutal mathematics of this specific tactical engagement. A single Collins-class submarine cost roughly $1 billion Australian dollars to completely construct and successfully deploy. The massive, technologically superior American carrier strike group she had just effortlessly penetrated was collectively worth significantly north of 20 billion United States dollars, representing a massive, highly asymmetric financial imbalance that terrified strategic defense planners everywhere. If a determined hostile nation could successfully build 10 quiet diesel-electric submarines for the exact price of one massive American carrier group, the strategic calculus shifted dramatically. If absolutely any one of those extremely cheap stealth submarines could potentially eliminate the billion-dollar centerpiece of that massive naval formation, then the entire foundational cost-benefit calculation of global American naval power projection was suddenly in very serious trouble. The brilliant HMAS Waller had just conclusively demonstrated this terrifying vulnerability with absolutely undeniable, crystal-clear photographic evidence taken right through a periscope. This terrifying tactical scenario was absolutely not just an abstract, highly theoretical academic argument debated endlessly inside comfortable Pentagon briefing rooms anymore. The heavily criticized Australian submarine had boldly ripped the comforting veil off American naval supremacy and vividly exposed a massive operational vulnerability that no amount of advanced nuclear technology could instantly fix. She fundamentally proved that their absolute reliance on detecting loud acoustic signatures had created a massive strategic blind spot that a smart, patient enemy could easily and lethally exploit during a real naval war. The deeply embarrassed exercise controllers were completely forced to officially concede the massive simulated victory to the silent Australian crew waiting quietly below the Pacific waves. There was absolutely no digital error, no technical glitch, and entirely no unfair interpretation of the strict engagement rules that could possibly save the mighty USS Abraham Lincoln from this humiliating digital destruction. The absolute most mocked military program in modern Australian history had just proudly delivered a completely undeniable, historically devastating tactical masterclass directly to the world's undisputed naval superpower. The aftermath of RIMPAC 2000 was absolutely not an isolated fluke that the United States Navy could comfortably sweep under the bureaucratic rug. The incredibly silent HMAS Waller aggressively returned to officially prove her devastating point once again. The following year, during the massive Operation Tandem Thrust in 2001, the brilliant Australian submarine deliberately operated in coastal waters, barely 70 meters deep. This highly dangerous acoustic depth was scarcely more than the stealthy submarine's own physical length, yet she completely dominated the complex tactical maritime environment. Operating in this incredibly shallow coastal environment, HMAS Waller effortlessly slipped past advanced acoustic sensors and successfully scored simulated eliminations on two separate United States Navy amphibious assault ships. These massive vessels were currently carrying hundreds of vulnerable combat marines, completely unaware of the deadly metallic predator lurking just below their massive hulls. Although the aggressive Australian submarine was eventually declared neutralized much later in the complex exercise, The terrifying strategic point had already been hammered home to the American command structure with absolutely brutal, undeniable clarity and precision. The humiliating tactical defeats continued relentlessly for the undisputed American naval superpower. In 2003, during another massive multinational exercise off Australia's strategic coast, the relentless Waller and her newly upgraded sister boat HMAS Rankin went aggressively head-to-head with highly advanced American nuclear opposition. Once again, the stealthy Waller successfully simulated the complete elimination of a massive Los Angeles-class attack submarine. Australian Commodore Mike Deeks proudly noted with unmistakable professional satisfaction that the incredibly arrogant Americans had been visibly shaken at the devastating exercise conclusion. 3 separate, massive multinational exercises spanning 3 consecutive years yielded remarkably consistent, utterly devastating tactical results against the greatest naval force on Earth. The heavily criticized Collins class was absolutely not a national joke anymore. It boldly became a highly studied academic case study in exactly what happens when a brilliantly trained naval crew aggressively exploits a massive asymmetric advantage that the technological opposition has simply not prepared for. The terrible mechanical noise problems that unfortunately fueled years of harsh public mockery had been completely and effectively fixed. The hopeless digital combat system had been fully replaced, and the unreliable diesel engines had been entirely rebuilt from the ground up. What proudly emerged from all those massive industrial repairs was the absolute largest conventionally powered tactical submarine on the entire planet. Stretching 77 meters long and displacing over 3,000 tons fully submerged, she boasted 6 deadly forward torpedo tubes and a massive surface patrol range of 11,000 nautical miles. Every single one of these impressive specifications had been severely questioned or completely dismissed previously. Every single one of those heavily mocked engineering specifications ultimately turned out to be exactly what was crucially needed to successfully crack the absolute most heavily defended naval formation on the global ocean. The United States Navy seriously responded with the absolute gravity and immense resources that this terrifying strategic situation completely demanded. Deeply entrenched American anti-submarine warfare doctrine was fundamentally rewritten from scratch to properly account for the terrifying diesel-electric acoustic threat that senior naval commanders had foolishly spent multiple decades completely dismissing as highly irrelevant. The severely rattled United States Navy immediately began spending massive amounts of money leasing advanced Gotland-class submarines directly from the Swedish government. These specific European vessels were widely considered the absolute quietest conventional boats in physical existence. The Pentagon also began regularly inviting upgraded Collins-class boats to aggressively participate in classified American naval exercises. These were absolutely not polite courtesy invitations extended to a minor geopolitical ally for basic diplomatic appearances. The deadly Australian and Swedish submarines were deliberately brought in as dedicated, highly lethal adversary forces. Their explicit operational job was to aggressively hunt highly valuable American aircraft carriers and massive surface groups repeatedly, strictly exercise after exercise. This grueling training allowed highly stressed American sonar operators and senior tactical officers to finally learn exactly what near-mechanical silence actually sounds like underwater. They frantically needed to properly develop brand new defensive tactics to successfully counter an incoming metallic object that produces almost no detectable acoustic signature. The fact that the massive Pentagon was paying real money to train against them tells you everything. That highly expensive naval lesson was incredibly public and absolutely impossible for the massive military establishment to ignore. In 2006, the deadly Mark 48 heavyweight torpedoes safely aboard the Collins class were heavily upgraded to the highly lethal Mod 7 variant, strictly developed jointly with the Americans. Just 2 years later, during RIMPAC 2008, the legendary HMAS Waller proudly became the very first submarine in either Allied Navy to successfully fire a fully armed version of this devastating new underwater weapon. Her designated physical target was the decommissioned Spruance-class guided missile destroyer USS Fletcher, floating quietly as a massive steel sacrifice. One perfectly aimed heavy torpedo resulted in one catastrophic structural hit, instantly translating into one fully confirmed physical elimination with live high-explosive ordnance. The heavily ridiculed dud sub had successfully proven in the absolute most literal way completely possible that she could consistently find a massive naval target, reach it completely undetected, and ruthlessly put a devastating heavyweight combat torpedo directly through its thick outer hull. There is a magnificent historical irony permanently embedded in the Waller's proud name that perfectly fits this incredible tactical story. The stealthy submarine was specifically named for brave Captain Hector Waller, who famously commanded the legendary Scrap Iron Flotilla during the dark days of the Second World War. These were 5 deeply battered, completely ancient surface destroyers that the arrogant German command actively mocked by name. The brave Australian sailors proudly wore that vicious international insult exactly like a shining military medal of absolute highest honor. Captain Waller later bravely commanded the light cruiser HMAS Perth and tragically went completely down with his highly damaged ship during the brutal Battle of Sunda Strait on the 1st of March 1942. He was fiercely fighting a massive Japanese naval force that heavily outnumbered and severely outgunned him in absolutely every single military category. The proud Australian tradition of successfully taking heavily criticized equipment that absolutely everyone else has completely written off and rapidly turning it into something incredibly lethal is absolutely not a historical fluke. This incredible naval resilience is permanently encoded in the very name proudly painted on the black submarine's thick outer hull. The legendary Rimpack 2000 incident currently remains one of the absolute most heavily referenced historical episodes in modern global naval warfare education. It consistently appears in highly classified war college syllabi, massive international defense white papers, and deeply complex strategic military procurement debates occurring on literally every single continent. Whenever any developing nation formally evaluates diesel-electric stealth submarines for robust coastal defense, this specific story immediately surfaces. The heavily upgraded HMAS Waller and the massive USS Abraham Lincoln instantly enter the highly classified strategic conversation. Whenever a desperate American naval admiral passionately argues for massively increased anti-submarine warfare, financial funding, that specific black and white periscope photograph vividly serves as the ultimate undeniable argument that completely needs no supportive caption. The complex Collins program itself obviously remains incredibly far from perfect today. The ambitious program occasionally sits right back on the Australian government's highly watched project of concern list due to ongoing complex logistical maintenance schedules. The mighty Australian nation is actively transitioning to massive nuclear-powered attack submarines under the highly historic AUKUS strategic pact with the United States and the United Kingdom. This massive shift is a clear, undeniable acknowledgement that traditional diesel-electric propulsion fundamentally has severe operational limits for conducting extremely long-range Indo-Pacific military operations. However, the legendary Waller's enduring historical legacy is absolutely not about the controversial Collins program's specific logistical maintenance record or its highly publicized, incredibly embarrassing political procurement scandals broadcast continuously across the Australian national media landscape. It is fundamentally about a highly dedicated professional crew that aggressively took a broken submarine absolutely everyone had completely given up on, boldly sailed it directly into the heavy teeth of the absolute most powerful naval defensive formation ever successfully assembled, and proudly proved that the undisputed global emperor actually had no sonar. The massive American naval forces obviously had the endless money. The proud Americans had the advanced technology. The highly trained Americans had the complex tactical doctrine. The incredibly stubborn Australians simply had mechanical silence. They brilliantly utilized extreme tactical patience and proudly commanded a black boat specifically named after a brave historical man who absolutely never stopped fiercely fighting in a damaged ship that absolutely everyone loudly said was completely finished. The final undeniable result quietly sits inside a highly classified intelligence file, currently buried somewhere deep inside the massive Pentagon. It is a striking photograph of a $4.5 billion supercarrier, perfectly framed right in the crosshairs of a periscope that proudly belonged to a submarine the entire world called junk. Absolutely no massive public ceremony immediately followed this incredible historical naval achievement. Absolutely no grand political speeches were loudly given by prominent government officials. The highly disciplined, completely silent crew of the victorious HMAS Waller simply went quietly home to their base at HMAS Stirling, securely located in Western Australia. They opened a freezing cold alcoholic beer and immediately started loudly complaining about the brutal upcoming mechanical maintenance schedule. That is simply the undeniable Australian way to successfully do the exact thing absolutely nobody ever thought mathematically possible.